His motionless hand rested on the wheelchair armrest while everyone else held their breath. The polished marble floor reflected the cold white chandelier above, every crystal throwing sharp fragments of light across the silent mansion as the soft hum of medical equipment filled the enormous bedroom. Kang Min-jae sat beside the panoramic window exactly where he had sat every morning for nearly 4 years. A thick cashmere blanket covered his motionless legs, untouched coffee released thin ribbons of steam beside him, and the scent of antiseptic mixed with expensive cedar furniture lingered heavily in the air. Once, his name had made rival syndicates disappear before sunrise. Now even his own body refused to answer him. His expression never changed. His eyes rarely moved. The physicians measured blood pressure, therapists stretched muscles that no longer obeyed, and trusted lieutenants delivered reports about shipments, negotiations, and security without expecting a response beyond the smallest nod. Nobody remembered the last time the Mafia boss had smiled. Some younger guards whispered they had never seen it happen at all. The mansion itself seemed to imitate its master. Conversations ended in hushed voices. Footsteps became softer near the second floor. Doors closed carefully to avoid disturbing the silence that surrounded Min-jae like invisible stone walls. Among dozens of employees, one person never altered her rhythm. Grace Johnson crossed the hallway carrying freshly folded towels against her chest, the crisp cotton brushing softly beneath her fingers while the scent of clean linen followed behind her. Her dark housekeeping uniform was perfectly pressed despite the long hours she worked, and a loose curl escaped beneath her neatly tied hair every afternoon no matter how carefully she fixed it that morning. She greeted every security guard with the same quiet smile. Some answered politely. Others ignored her completely. One servant muttered that spending extra time caring for a man who barely acknowledged anyone was pointless. Grace simply continued walking. Inside Min-jae's room, she replaced the untouched coffee with a fresh cup before the old one cooled completely. She adjusted the curtains just enough for warm sunlight to reach his face without shining directly into his eyes. She noticed a tiny crease in the blanket beneath his wrist and smoothed it flat with gentle fingers. When his wheelchair squeaked almost imperceptibly, she knelt beside it with a small bottle of machine oil, wiping the chrome frame with a soft cloth until the sound disappeared. She never announced what she was doing. She simply did it. Min-jae's eyes followed none of the movements, yet every detail around him slowly became more comfortable because of her presence. As evening settled across the estate, amber light spilled through the tall windows while distant cicadas hummed beyond the stone garden walls. Most employees clocked out exactly on schedule. Grace remained behind to prepare the nighttime medications after another maid reported feeling ill. 1 hour became 2. Then another caregiver failed to arrive because of a traffic accident across town. Grace quietly accepted the additional shift without complaint. She reheated soup that Min-jae barely tasted, replaced cooling packs, checked blankets, answered nurses, and organized tomorrow's medication tray beneath the soft yellow bedside lamp. By midnight, faint shadows rested beneath her eyes, and her shoulders dipped for the first time that day. She picked up the final stack of folded towels, paused beside Min-jae's silent wheelchair, and glanced toward the empty hallway where no replacement had appeared. Then she quietly placed her phone face down, pulled another chair beside him instead of leaving the room, and whispered to herself, "Just a little longer." Grace pushed the wheelchair toward the eastern sunroom just before dawn, the rubber tires whispering across polished oak while the first pale ribbons of sunlight filtered through towering glass panels, warming the cool air that had lingered all night inside the mansion. Every morning for years, the nurses had followed the same routine, positioning Kang Min-jae beside the window for exactly 20 minutes before returning him to his bedroom. Grace quietly changed that ritual. She stopped the chair near a shelf filled with living orchids instead of the empty corner everyone else preferred. The flowers carried a faint sweet fragrance, and tiny beads of water still clung to their petals after the automatic misting system finished its cycle. She opened one narrow window just enough for fresh air to drift inside, carrying the distant sound of birds hidden beyond the estate walls. A senior caretaker frowned. "He doesn't notice any of this," the woman muttered while checking a clipboard. Grace simply folded the blanket more neatly across Min-jae's knees and answered without looking up. Maybe he does. She placed a small speaker on the side table and pressed play. Soft piano music flowed quietly through the room, blending with the gentle rustle of leaves outside. One of the security captains immediately stepped forward. Turn that off. The boss always preferred silence. Grace glanced at Min-jae before lowering the volume instead of switching it off completely. The doctor said hearing often remains stronger than people think. The captain frowned but said nothing further. Min-jae remained perfectly still. Yet his eyes lingered on the orchid several seconds longer than usual before returning toward the window. Grace noticed. She said nothing. Later that afternoon she wheeled him through the mansion's private library while dust floated lazily through shafts of golden light. Leather-bound books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves, their aged pages releasing the faint scent of paper and cedar. Instead of reading business reports aloud as instructed, Grace picked up a collection of American short stories and quietly read a single page. Her voice remained calm, never dramatic, filling the enormous room with ordinary conversation rather than medical instructions. Min-jae gave no visible reaction, but when she paused to return the book, his gaze remained fixed on the closed cover instead of drifting toward the floor. Again, Grace quietly noticed. That evening the physical therapist arrived carrying resistance bands and rehabilitation equipment. The therapy session ended early after another disappointing attempt produced no measurable improvement. As the therapist packed away the equipment with a heavy sigh, Grace stepped beside Min-jae's wheelchair, gently repositioned his right hand that had slipped against the armrest, then wrapped his fingers loosely around a warm ceramic mug filled with herbal tea before supporting it with both of her hands. Steam curled upward between them, carrying the earthy scent of chamomile. "Just for a minute," she whispered. His fingers remained motionless, but the mug stayed upright long enough for the warmth to spread across his palm before she carefully removed it. The therapist watched from the doorway. "That isn't part of the treatment plan." Grace smiled faintly while placing the cup back onto its saucer. "Maybe not. But people shouldn't forget what warmth feels like." Night settled over the estate once again. The marble hallways reflected pools of amber light from antique wall sconces, and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock echoed through the otherwise silent mansion. Grace finished organizing the final medication tray long after every other employee had left. She glanced at the staff schedule taped beside the nursing station. Another overnight caregiver had called in sick. She reached for the attendance sheet, picked up a pen, and quietly wrote her own name into the vacant shift before carrying the tray toward Min-jae's room, choosing without hesitation to remain beside the man who had not smiled in years. The sharp beep of a cardiac monitor sliced through the midnight silence just as Grace reached for the water pitcher. Cool blue emergency lights blinked across the polished floor while the faint scent of rubbing alcohol spread through the room as two night nurses hurried inside. One oxygen sensor had slipped loose from Kong Min-jae's finger while he shifted slightly in his wheelchair, triggering the alarm throughout the private medical wing. A young nurse rushed toward him with trembling hands, nearly knocking over the stand in her haste. Grace stepped forward first. She steadied the rolling stand before it tipped, caught the dangling monitor cable, and calmly secured the sensor back around Min-jae's finger with slow, practiced movements. The shrill alarm stopped immediately, replaced by the steady rhythm of measured heartbeats echoing softly through the room. Everyone exhaled together. One security officer shook his head. "You move like you've worked here 20 years. Grace simply straightened the blanket over Min-jae's knees before wiping the polished chrome armrest with a clean cloth. "Someone has to stay calm," she answered quietly. The nurses returned to their stations. The lights dimmed again. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the stone fountain continued its gentle splash beneath silver moonlight, its sound blending with the whisper of the mansion's ventilation system. Grace noticed the room had become unusually cold. She walked to the fireplace, placed another cedar log onto the glowing embers, and watched orange flames slowly stretch upward. Warm wood smoke carried a faint earthy fragrance through the room. Without asking anyone's permission, she rolled Min-jae's wheelchair 3 feet closer to the fire. The warmth reached his hands almost immediately. A senior lieutenant entered carrying a leather portfolio filled with business documents requiring Min-jae's approval. He stopped beside the fireplace, glanced at the new position of the wheelchair, then frowned. His chair has always faced the window. Grace looked toward the dancing flames before answering. Tonight the fire is warmer than the glass. The lieutenant stared at her for several seconds but said nothing. He quietly placed the portfolio back under his arm and left without presenting a single document. For the first time in years, no late-night business meeting interrupted Min-jae's rest. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, Grace wheeled him into the indoor conservatory adjoining the bedroom. Soft yellow lanterns illuminated rows of carefully maintained bamboo and flowering jasmine while warm air carried the delicate perfume of blossoms through the glass enclosure. She picked up a watering can, its cool metal handle pressing against her palm, and slowly watered each plant while speaking aloud as if someone had asked about her day. She described a child laughing in the grocery store that morning, an elderly cashier who insisted on giving her extra change after she dropped a coin, and how one stubborn orchid had finally begun blooming again after weeks of careful attention. She never expected a reply. She simply refused to let silence become the only language in the room. When she finished, she returned beside Min-jae and noticed something almost invisible. His eyes no longer rested on the empty marble floor. They remained fixed on the blooming white orchid nearest the window. Grace carefully moved the flower pot onto the small table beside his chair where it would remain within his view. She adjusted nothing else. She only smiled faintly and dimmed the conservatory lights before guiding him back toward the bedroom. As she prepared to end another exhausting shift, the morning supervisor called to report that 2 additional caregivers would be absent for the next 24 hours. Grace closed her eyes for a brief second, slipped her phone into her apron pocket, removed her coat instead of putting it on, and quietly turned back toward Min-jae's room, choosing once again to stay. Grace arrived with a steaming bowl of rice porridge just as the grandfather clock struck 5, its deep chime rolling gently through the mansion while the warm aroma of ginger and sesame drifted across the quiet bedroom. Pale morning light slipped through the linen curtains, softening the hard edges of the medical equipment surrounding calm Min-jae's chair. She set the porcelain bowl onto a walnut tray, its smooth surface giving off faint warmth beneath her fingertips, then replaced yesterday's flowers with fresh white lilies whose clean fragrance slowly displaced the lingering scent of disinfectant. Every object around him seemed to breathe a little easier after she entered. The morning nurse reviewed medication charts with clipped efficiency before leaving for another patient. Grace remained. She wiped a thin layer of dust from the bookshelf, straightened a family photograph that no one else had noticed leaning sideways, and gently polished the silver frame with the edge of a soft cotton cloth until it reflected the growing daylight. Min-jae's eyes rested on the photograph for several quiet seconds. Grace followed his gaze, carefully returned the picture to its place, and said nothing. She had learned that silence could sometimes carry more respect than conversation. Later that afternoon, the estate's rehabilitation specialist arrived with another rigid schedule. Timers beeped softly. Resistance bands stretched and relaxed with dry rubber snaps. Every movement was measured down to the second. When the session ended, the therapist packed his equipment with visible disappointment. No meaningful response today, he sighed before leaving. The room felt colder after the door closed. Grace walked to the record player standing beneath the window, selected an old vinyl album she had found in the library archives, and lowered the needle with careful fingers. A gentle orchestral melody filled the room, accompanied by the faint crackle of aging vinyl. She wheeled Min-jae toward the terrace doors where afternoon sunlight painted warm rectangles across the hardwood floor. Outside, gardeners trimmed hedges while the fountain sent shimmering droplets into the air. Grace picked up a small pair of pruning scissors and carefully removed a single wilted leaf from the orchid beside his chair. Even healthy plants need someone to notice the smallest things, she murmured while placing fresh water into the ceramic pot. She never looked directly at him after speaking. She simply continued caring for the flowers as naturally as breathing. As evening settled across the estate, amber lamps illuminated the long hallway, their light reflecting across polished brass handrails. Grace reviewed tomorrow's medication schedule and quietly noticed that one dosage had been listed an hour earlier than prescribed. She compared the physician's handwritten order against the digital chart, then calmly corrected the mistake before preparing the tray. When the attending doctor returned, he paused over the revised schedule, adjusted his glasses, and slowly nodded. "Good catch," he admitted. "That would have caused unnecessary discomfort." Grace only smiled politely before carrying the tray into Minjae's room. She neither mentioned the correction nor expected recognition. She simply continued her work. As night deepened, rain tapped softly against the tall windows while warm lamplight settled over the thick wool blanket across Minjae's legs. Grace replaced the cooling tea with a fresh cup, adjusted the pillow supporting his shoulders by less than an inch, then noticed his left hand resting awkwardly against the wheelchair arm. She gently repositioned his fingers onto the blanket, smoothing the fabric beneath them until every crease disappeared. This time, his eyes followed her hands from beginning to end. It lasted only a heartbeat before his gaze returned toward the window, but Grace noticed the difference without reacting. She switched off the brightest overhead lights, leaving only the soft glow of a reading lamp beside his chair, then quietly placed another overnight staffing form onto the desk. Every remaining caregiver had already completed their hours. Grace picked up the pen, signed her own name beneath the vacant shift for the fourth consecutive night, folded the paper neatly, and returned to sit beside the man who had not smiled in years. The hallway lights dimmed one by one as midnight settled over the estate, leaving only the warm glow of bedside lamps reflecting softly across polished walnut furniture while the steady ticking of the antique clock echoed through the otherwise silent floor. Grace carried a fresh blanket folded neatly over her arm, its thick wool brushing gently against her fingertips as she entered Kong Minjae's room for what should have been the final check before ending another impossibly long shift. The faint fragrance of chamomile tea lingered beside his chair, mixing with the clean scent of freshly changed linens. She quietly measured his temperature, adjusted the monitor cable resting beneath his sleeve, and replaced the water pitcher with a newly chilled one that gathered tiny beads of condensation along its glass surface. Outside the tall windows, moonlight silvered the stone garden while the fountain continued its gentle rhythm somewhere beyond the hedges. Every task finished. Every chart completed. Every medication prepared for dawn. Grace finally lowered herself into the wooden chair beside Minjae to organize tomorrow's handwritten notes. Her shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. She rubbed one tired wrist before opening a small notebook whose pages had softened from constant use. She reviewed tomorrow's schedule twice, corrected a medication reminder, then tucked the notebook into her apron pocket. Across the room, the fireplace had settled into glowing embers, releasing a faint cedar fragrance that filled the quiet space with gentle warmth. Grace stood once more, walked to the hearth, added one final log, and watched orange flames slowly rise with a soft crackling sound. The extra warmth reached Minjae's blanket almost immediately. She returned beside him, carefully adjusting the blanket over his knees for what had become an unconscious habit. Her fingers paused only long enough to smooth a single wrinkle before she whispered, "Good night, Mr. Kong." No answer came. None ever had. She intended to leave. Instead, another message appeared on her phone. The replacement caregiver had been delayed again. Grace stared at the glowing screen for several silent seconds before locking it without replying. She placed the phone face down on the small side table and quietly remained where she was. Minutes drifted into an hour. The room became almost perfectly still except for the whisper of the fireplace and the gentle breathing carried through Minjae's oxygen support. Grace reviewed tomorrow's housekeeping checklist, but the words slowly blurred together beneath the soft amber lamp. She blinked repeatedly, trying to stay focused. Her hand loosened around the clipboard. The pencil rolled quietly across the polished tabletop. She reached for it, stopped halfway, then leaned back for only a moment, intending to rest her eyes before standing again. The chair beside Minjae sat close enough that her elbow lightly brushed the blanket covering his arm. Warm firelight softened the tired lines across her face while a loose curl slipped free beside her cheek. The notebook remained tucked against her apron. One hand still rested protectively near the medication tray as if even in exhaustion she refused to leave her responsibilities behind. Her breathing gradually slowed into the peaceful rhythm of someone who had finally surrendered to sleep after too many nights without proper rest. Nothing dramatic happened. No alarm sounded. No one entered the room. Only the quiet glow of the fireplace, the fragrance of cedar and chamomile, and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock witnessed the simple truth that no one else had seen. Grace, the woman everyone considered only a maid, had fallen asleep beside the man she had refused to abandon. And across the room, unnoticed by her closed eyes, Kong Min-jae remained awake, his gaze fixed not on the window, not on the fire, but on the exhausted woman sleeping peacefully within arm's reach. Min-jae's fingers moved. Barely half an inch, but enough for the silver teaspoon resting beside his hand to slide across the polished wood with a sharp metallic click that sliced through the quiet room. Grace's eyes opened instantly. She pushed herself upright before she was fully awake, the wool blanket slipping from her shoulders onto the hardwood floor with a muffled sound. Warm firelight still flickered across the stone fireplace while the faint scent of cedar lingered in the air, but her attention locked entirely on the motion she had almost convinced herself she had imagined. She stepped closer, the soft soles of her shoes whispering against the Persian rug, and stared at Min-jae's right hand. His fingers rested still once more. She knelt beside him, placing 2 careful fingertips against his wrist as she had done countless times before. The pulse remained steady. She reached for the rehabilitation journal, flipping through neatly dated entries whose paper had begun to curl from months of handling. Every therapist had written the same conclusion. No voluntary movement. No measurable progress. She looked back at the teaspoon lying several inches farther than she remembered leaving it. Instead of calling the medical team, Grace quietly returned it to its place. She deliberately positioned the handle against the edge of the table again before stepping back. "If that was you," she whispered, her voice softer than the crackling fire, "you don't have to prove anything to me." She waited. Silence settled over the room. The antique clock continued marking each passing second. Then another tiny sound came. Tap. The spoon shifted again. Not far. Just enough for the polished metal to catch the orange glow of the fireplace as it rolled against the tabletop. Grace covered her mouth with one trembling hand, not from fear but to keep herself from gasping loud enough to disturb him. She immediately checked the monitor. Every reading remained stable. No involuntary muscle spasms registered. She leaned closer, her lavender soap mingling with the clean scent of fresh linens. "Mr. Kong?" she asked gently. His eyes remained fixed forward, but something inside them had changed. They no longer drifted without focus. They followed her. Grace slowly raised one finger. "Can you see this?" His pupils tracked the movement from left to right with unmistakable precision. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to call everyone into the room. Instead, she reached into the cabinet and removed the small therapy ball the rehabilitation staff had nearly stopped using weeks earlier. Its textured rubber surface felt cool in her hands. She placed it carefully against his palm. "Only if you want to." Several long seconds passed. Firelight danced across the leather armrest. Somewhere outside, a night bird called once before disappearing into the darkness. Then, almost imperceptibly, his fingers pressed against the ball. Weak. Slow. Real. Grace closed her eyes for a heartbeat before opening them again, making certain she had not imagined it. She smiled without making a sound. Rather than celebrating, she quietly wrote the exact time in the rehabilitation journal, describing only observable facts in her neat handwriting. She signed her initials beneath the entry and gently closed the notebook. When the household physician arrived an hour later for the routine morning examination, Grace slipped the journal into his hands before anyone else entered the room. "Please examine him again," she said calmly. "I believe something has changed." The physician studied her face, then glanced toward Min-jae, whose steady gaze never left the exhausted maid standing beside his chair, and without another word he ordered every scheduled meeting for the day cancelled immediately. The physician's second examination transformed the mansion without a single raised voice. Stainless steel instruments clicked softly onto a tray while cool morning light spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows, washing the room in pale silver. Every member of the medical team repeated the same tests twice. Grace remained near the doorway with her hands folded over her apron, saying nothing as Min-jae followed each instruction with slow, deliberate movements. His fingertips squeezed the textured therapy ball again. His eyes tracked every object placed before him. When asked to blink once for yes and twice for no, he answered every question correctly. The physician removed his glasses, polishing the lenses with an unsteady hand before looking toward the waiting executives. His neurological response has returned beyond every expectation, he said quietly. This is voluntary. This is real. The words drifted through the room like a stone dropped into still water. One executive immediately stepped forward, already discussing rehabilitation schedules and business announcements, but Min-jae interrupted him without speaking. He slowly lifted one finger and pointed across the room. Every eye followed the gesture until it stopped on Grace. She stood frozen beside the bookshelf, sunlight outlining loose strands of hair that had escaped her bun. The physician understood first. He wants her. Grace hesitated before approaching. The polished oak floor creaked beneath her careful steps. She knelt beside his chair, close enough to hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing. Min-jae struggled for several seconds before his lips finally formed a sound that had not left them in years. His voice emerged rough and cracked, barely louder than the fireplace embers settling behind him. Stay. The single word silenced the room more completely than any command he had ever given as the head of the organization. Grace lowered her eyes, then gave a small nod. One executive cleared his throat. Chairman, today's board meeting determines control of 3 overseas operations. The investors are already waiting. Min-jae looked toward the conference folder resting on the side table. Its black leather cover reflected the morning light. With slow determination, he reached for it. His arm trembled. Grace instinctively stepped forward, but he gently shook his head. Inch by inch, he stretched farther until his fingertips rested on the folder. He pushed it away. The heavy binder slid across the polished table before falling onto the carpet with a muted thud. Every executive stared. Min-jae drew another difficult breath. Later, he whispered. His first decision after years of silence was not about territory, profit, or power. It was about recovery. The physician smiled faintly before ordering the rehabilitation equipment brought into the mansion immediately instead of transporting the patient elsewhere. Within an hour, parallel bars, therapy bands, and mobility equipment filled the once formal library. The scent of fresh rubber and disinfectant replaced the aroma of expensive cigars that had once defined the estate. Grace rolled up the sleeves of her plain uniform and carefully adjusted each piece according to the therapist's instructions. She steadied Min-jae beneath one arm as he attempted to stand. His polished shoes scraped against the hardwood. Every muscle resisted. Sweat gathered along his forehead despite the cool air from the ceiling vents. He nearly lost his balance after only a few inches, but Grace planted both feet firmly against the floor and held him without panic. He steadied himself instead of collapsing back into the chair. For the first time in years, he remained upright. The room filled with restrained applause before immediately falling silent again. Min-jae turned his head toward Grace, breathing hard, and in a voice still fragile but unmistakably clear, he said, "Tomorrow, we walk farther." Morning sunlight poured through the mansion's glass walls, turning the rehabilitation room into a sea of warm gold while the faint scent of brewed coffee drifted in from the kitchen. The polished parallel bars gleamed beneath the light, and every servant paused their work without being told, pretending to dust shelves or arrange flowers while quietly watching from a respectful distance. Grace adjusted the leather support belt around Min-jae's waist, checking each buckle twice before stepping beside him. The fabric of her sleeves was damp from the long hours of therapy, and a loose strand of hair rested against her cheek, but she ignored both. "Only as far as you can," she said softly. Min-jae nodded once. His hands wrapped around the cool steel bars. Muscles that had forgotten their purpose trembled beneath his tailored shirt. He pushed downward. His shoes scraped across the hardwood with a dry, steady sound. One step. Then another. Each movement demanded every ounce of concentration, yet he refused to stop. Grace never pulled him forward. She simply remained beside him, one hand hovering inches from his elbow, ready only if needed. At the end of the 10-foot lane, he released one bar and stood unsupported for 2 full seconds before lowering himself carefully into the waiting chair. The rehabilitation physician looked down at his stopwatch before quietly smiling. Yesterday you couldn't stand alone. Today you walked 12 feet. Before anyone could congratulate him, Min-jae looked toward Grace instead. His voice remained rough but steadier than before. You stayed. She offered only a small smile. I promised. The simple exchange settled over the room more heavily than applause. That afternoon, the mansion's executive board gathered once again in the formal conference hall. Crystal chandeliers reflected across the glossy walnut table while porcelain teacups released thin streams of fragrant steam. The directors expected their recovering chairman to approve delayed business decisions. Instead, Min-jae entered slowly with the assistance of a cane rather than a wheelchair. Every chair shifted as people rose to their feet. The room filled with the faint rustle of expensive suits. Grace quietly stopped outside the doors, intending to return to her duties. Come in, Min-jae called before anyone else spoke. She hesitated. This meeting isn't for staff. He met her eyes. It is today. The room fell silent as she stepped inside, the soft soles of her shoes making almost no sound against the thick carpet. She stood near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable beneath the attention of powerful men who had never once acknowledged her presence. Min-jae rested both hands on the polished table. While I was unable to move, every specialist measured my body. He paused, drawing a careful breath. Only one person remembered I was still human. No one interrupted. Outside, wind brushed gently against the tall windows, carrying the distant sound of leaves across the courtyard. Min-jae turned toward the head administrator. Effective immediately, Grace will no longer serve as household maid. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Grace herself looked up in surprise. She will oversee my personal recovery program with full authority to determine my daily schedule. Every department will cooperate. The administrator opened his folder as if preparing to object, but Min-jae lifted one hand. His movement was slow, yet absolute. The folder closed again without a word. Authority had returned, not through intimidation, but through unmistakable resolve. Grace quietly shook her head. Mr. Kong. I'm not qualified. He answered without hesitation. You never treated me like a position. That's the qualification I trust. The physician nodded in agreement before handing Grace the official rehabilitation file. She accepted it with both hands, feeling the textured leather cover against her fingertips as every executive watched the transfer. The balance inside the mansion shifted in that silent moment, and before the meeting ended, Min-jae announced one final decision that left every person in the room staring at him in stunned silence. The conference room remained perfectly still after Min-jae's announcement. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the walnut table, turning the crystal water glasses into ribbons of gold, while the faint aroma of green tea lingered in the quiet air. Every executive waited for him to explain why a maid now carried authority over the schedule of one of the most powerful men in the country. Min-jae rested both hands on the polished cane beside his chair before speaking again. For years this house followed my orders, he said, his voice still rough but steady. Yet the only person who gave me what I truly needed never had any authority at all. His eyes settled on Grace. She stood motionless, holding the rehabilitation file against her chest. The leather cover felt warm beneath her fingertips from the sunlight pouring through the windows. She never chased my approval. She never expected a reward. She simply stayed. No one argued. Even the senior directors lowered their eyes. The meeting ended without another objection, and one by one the executives quietly left the room, their footsteps fading into the marble hallway. A few weeks later, spring had settled over the estate. Cherry blossoms drifted through the courtyard, landing softly on the stone path while birdsong echoed from the gardens. The rehabilitation sessions had become longer every day. Grace walked beside Minjae beneath the flowering trees, carrying only a small bottle of water and a folded towel instead of supporting his weight. His cane tapped rhythmically against the path. Tap. Step. Tap. Step. At the end of the garden stood the wooden bench where Grace had once fallen asleep beside his wheelchair after another exhausting night. Minjae stopped there. He looked at the bench for several quiet seconds before slowly sitting down without assistance. Grace smiled. "That's farther than yesterday." He nodded. "And tomorrow will be farther still." The mansion no longer revolved around silence and fear. Laughter from the kitchen occasionally reached the gardens. Staff members walked through the halls without lowering their heads. Fresh flowers appeared in every room instead of expensive decorations alone. None of those changes had been announced. They had simply followed the example set by the man who had finally remembered how to smile. As the evening sun painted the sky with shades of amber and rose, Minjae reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the small rehabilitation journal Grace had kept since the beginning. Its pages had grown worn, the corners softened by months of careful use. He opened to the very first entry, where every doctor had written that meaningful recovery was unlikely. Then he turned to the latest page, filled with records of every new step, every regained movement, every impossible victory. He handed the journal to Grace. "Keep it." She looked at him in surprise. "It's yours." He shook his head gently. "No. It's ours." A light breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers between them. Grace accepted the journal with both hands, her eyes lingering on the pages before closing the cover. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. They simply watched the last rays of sunlight settle across the quiet garden that no longer felt like a prison. Then Minjae smiled, not because his strength had fully returned, nor because his power had been restored, but because he finally understood that the greatest miracle of his recovery had begun on the night he opened his eyes and found one exhausted maid asleep beside him, proving that sometimes the smallest act of faithful kindness can awaken a life that power alone never could.